I take the opportunity to introduce you Professor Serdar Degirmencioglu and to explain you the sense of what we are doing. And I'm pleased that we have our wonderful colleague doing archaeological work in Syria and in Turkey, and so she's a very good testimonial of our collaboration in the university, but also she is a good voice about Turkey and Syria and Middle East. We had yesterday the visit of the ambassador of Italy in Turkey, Pisani di Massamorbil, who came thinking that the event was yesterday, and he arrived and then, dopo vi traduco quando parla lui, quando parlo io pure che non capite non fa niente. And he arrived and he said he was apologizing what Italy did and what Europe not did for Turkey, thinking that times ago if Europe would have done differently, probably Erdogan would not go in the way he is gone, and so this the separation between Europe and Turkey would not be there. But I'm very pleased to introduce you Serdar Degirmencioglu, first because we are very good friends. He is the previous president of the European Association of Community Psychology. And he is a community psychologist, but he is very strong involved in children's rights, and he is working on children issues and developmental psychology. But in the last time, he's also very strong involved in the refugee question and political asylum, people coming to Europe for political asylum reasons. And why we decide to have this conference today? We decide to have this conference today because Serdar was the dean, the director of the Department of Psychology in the Doğuş University in Ankara, in Istanbul, and he was fired out. He was fired out because of his political visions. And the last time that something like this happened in Europe, it was at the time of Mussolini, where we had professors in the university that had to swear their fidelity to the system and to this national system. And so I think that it's something very serious and very heavy, and whatever, it's very. Then he will explain us the rest and the situation, but just this is already a very terrible fact that happened to a colleague of us teaching, and is a strong attack against the freedom of teaching, freedom of mind, freedom of opinions. And then, second reason that I'm very pleased to have Serdar here is that this Turkey, Middle East, Syria, and question at this moment is very bad, very hard. We listen a lot of very bad things from TV and from television, but the worst is that it's very difficult to understand what is happening there. And it is very difficult. I was trying to understand something before he was coming, and I had to introduce him. I said, let me say something not silly. Let me make a good introduction. And the only things that I was able to do is to understand that there are a lot of things working at the same time, and it is very difficult to understand what is happening. And so I think that having with us Serdar Degirmencioglu, we can understand something more on the vision of the nowadays times, not seeing from US, not seeing from Brussels, but seeing from Ankara, and not only Istanbul, but he is at the moment visiting professor in Cairo. And he told me yesterday such terrible things about Cairo University and about the situation in Egypt at the moment, that all my memory of a charming, changing, projected to the future Egypt, it was the country of Naguib Mahfouz, the country of Nawal al-Saadawi, is now the country of dead. And he made me yesterday evening such a terrible report about what's happening now in Egypt that I really was really sad. And so I think that this opportunity to talk, to interact, and to give food for our brain and for our heart, it's a very good thing, and I am very pleased that Serdar gave us his time to come here. And I must say I'm also pleased that our international connections are working, because this event today is together with the with the Ordine degli Psicologi of Campania region, and we have here the president Antonella Bozzaotra. But it goes also with good wishes of the European Association of Community Psychology, and all the board is asked to have a video to have a report of this conference. And some more, the American Association of Community Psychology, SCRA, they give me a little budget, and with this little budget of our American friends, we were able to support his coming in Italy. So we have an European, US, Italian connection for doing something that will be helpful and reachful for our mind and for our heart. So finishing, then I will give the floor to Serdar to talk, and then we try to translate. So when he's talking, we are helping, because language and English is not our best quality. We try to do it. And then we will interact with different persons and with all of us asking, because I think that the best thing that we can do is to ask, and together to find out some possible shared thoughts and even shared path for the future. So Serdar, please.
First of all, I would like to thank the opportunity to be here, which is something I really appreciate. And I would like to thank Katerina as well as everyone who has spent at least a little piece of time to arrange this. Okay. And what I would like to do is to speak slowly so that you can follow, but I will also use the slides. And I hope that I will take only 25 minutes so that you can have some amount of time to ask questions. Okay. Some of the things that we will talk about today are not easy to talk about, and I will not show you any difficult photos. I don't want any sensational material in this, but some of the things that I will find to say, you may find objectionable or you may not like. Please tell me if you do. Okay. Just as Katerina described, I am a psychologist. I was trained in the United States as a developmental psychologist, but because over the years my work became more community psychology focused, I became more and more interested in community psychology. So now I call myself a developmental psychologist, community psychologist together. Okay. And I work quite a bit with young people. And over the years, what I have noticed is that children are my friends, and they don't necessarily care if I come from Turkey, if I come from Syria, or if I come from Colombia. And children also don't care about flags. They don't care about nationalism. So working with children in that sense is very good. But as people grow up, they start to use other things to judge people. Therefore, today I stand before you as someone who's from Turkey, and I love my country, but I don't love it because I'm a nationalistic person. So I love all sorts of countries, including Napoli. And it's not simply because of the pizza or because of Caterina, it's just that I find things that are very attractive here. Okay. Yeah, the trippa and so on. Okay, so I will sit down and give you a few things. I am unable to speak in Italian, therefore I would have to speak in English. I wish I could talk to you in Turkish, but I know that no one here knows Turkish, therefore we have to communicate through English. Okay. Excluding you, perhaps. Okay. Now, 2016 has been a very difficult year for people in Turkey in general. But it has been also very difficult for people working at universities and for universities per se. Meaning that as far as people such as myself are concerned, the end of universities has come. Turkey does not seem to have a suitable environment, a political environment for universities and academic freedom now. But I will try to explain. And I will try to explain as simply as possible. So 2016 has been a very dark year. On January 11th, very early this year, a group of people signed a declaration asking the government of Turkey to stop its assault on civilians. And when I say assault on civilians, I don't mean individuals. This was many rather large towns being surrounded by so-called security forces and curfews being declared, and many people over the course of 1 week, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes longer, getting killed in a specific place. And this was something that people such as myself could not stand. We had to say something.
Can you better explain?
Sure.
Lui sta dicendo che in Turchia c'erano dei posti dove la gente veniva uccisa, civili, but can you better explain, because it sounds very...
I will give you a background in the next slides, but just so that everybody is clear, when you deploy an army and deploy police forces and send them to an area occupied by civilians, it is very clear what's going to happen. If they are told to be indiscriminately hard on people, just like everywhere else. Doesn't matter if the forces are from the US, doesn't matter if the forces are from Italy. An army is designed to kill. Therefore, if you send an army to a place populated by civilians, that's what is going to happen. Therefore, in these towns, many people were killed, mainly because the government argued that they were supporting the guerrillas, they were supporting an unwanted movement. But this is something that we have seen all over the world. If there is one person in one neighborhood and you kill the entire neighborhood to kill this person, this is completely unacceptable. And this is unacceptable from a human rights point of view or from other points of view as well. Okay, but I will better explain later on. So about 1,124 people signed a declaration asking the government to stop killing civilians. And we ask the government because a government is responsible to explain what it's doing, and a government is supposed to respond to citizens. So as a citizen, I ask the government to stop its war on civilians. 2 days later, just 2 days later, a witch hunt started, meaning that the current government started its attack on academics who signed this peace declaration. Just in 20 days or so, more than 20 young people were fired from their jobs. On January 18th, an internal investigation was started at my university about me and about someone else, Aslı Vatansever, who signed this petition. And I am very specific with dates so that you understand. It only took 2 days for the witch hunt to start, and it took only 7 days for the university administration to start an investigation about me. That means the order to start an investigation and the order to start a witch hunt came from the most powerful person in Turkey. Just about a month later, on the 12th of February, I was removed from my position as the chairperson of the psychology department, and the dean replaced me, which meant that the dean could allow people to come into the psychology department, and they very quickly moved to find new people for the psychology department. This I hope to get into later because the university administration wanted to get rid of me anyway. And in April, new people came into the department without any consultation with the department faculty members. And on April the 29th, I was dismissed from my position at the university. And the only reason they gave was because I signed a petition that the government considered incorrect, a wrong approach to politics. Okay, in other words, I was labeled someone who was a traitor to the country. Okay, so signing a peace petition, signing a piece of paper basically meant for the government a kind of very bad gesture that had to be punished. And on the same day, someone was also fired, Aslı Vatansever. She was a sociologist at the same university. So by the end of the year, December 2016, I now work in Cairo, and Aslı is now in Germany, just like many other people. Many people, such as myself, have had to leave Turkey, and they are now working in different places. Some of them are in Germany, some of them are in France, and in other places as well. Not many people in Italy. Okay, so let me explain. What happened in 2015 that led us to sign a peace petition? In 2015, the ruling party, AKP, the Justice and Development Party, wanted a 4th consecutive term. And they wanted to win a large majority of seats in the parliament so that they can change the constitution. Now, the constitution of Turkey is not the best constitution in the world anyway, but they wanted to make this constitution an even worse constitution, which allowed for a US-style presidency, meaning that there would be a president above the cabinet and the cabinet and the prime minister would no longer be the highest level of decision making. So it would be just like Obama, or it would be just like Donald Trump. So this intention to install a new president was clearly the design of the ruling party, and it was clearly the design of the current president. He is the president, therefore he now wants a president's position with even more power to make decisions. Okay. And he clearly warned that there would be a chaos in Turkey if he did not get the majority. And he said this very clearly. Okay. So when someone says a chaos would come, you may not know what kind of chaos it could be. But this was a clear threat. The elections were held on June the 7th. And the People's Democratic Party, which is HDP, it received substantial votes to climb over the 10% cutoff point. People's Democratic Party is the party that represents the Kurdish movement in Turkey, as well as many of the socialist movements. This 10% cutoff has been used by the regime to silence particularly the minorities, particularly the groups of people who did not have sufficient number of votes. But it was particularly used to silence the Kurdish movement. But once People's Democratic Party climbed over the 10%, they got many seats. And these seats used to go to the governing party. Okay. Now, you may not know this system, but the system basically says if a party does not have sufficient votes to go over the 10%, this party loses the votes that it receives, and the seats go to the party that's the second biggest party in that region. Okay. Therefore, every election with this idea was basically an election where the governing party won unfair seats. Okay. But this is what happens when there is a threshold. Okay. So the governing party, AKP, lost its majority, and the overall result was a so-called hung parliament. Hung parliament meaning a parliament where there isn't a clear majority. The president of Turkey has the powers to choose who forms the government, but he did not go to seek alternatives. Rather, he installed a new strategy. This strategy was a strategy of death. So death in Turkey became a political strategy. Okay. And there are places in the world where death was used as a strategy. To people such as myself, it sounds as a very horrible idea. However, it can be used. So the government stopped peace talks with the Kurdish guerrilla forces. Curfews were declared in several towns, just as I mentioned at the beginning, and the government started to use its military power on civilians. The show of brutal military power attracted support from hardline nationalists. Okay. Nationalism is a kind of sickness that plagues the world, and it can make people basically blind. And people who are nationalists often don't seek justice because they think nationalism is what's important, not justice. And the show of brutal power was also supported by people who like authoritarians. Okay. In many countries today, including many countries in Europe right now, people think that a strong leader is what's needed. So this strong leader could be someone like Berlusconi, someone like a Mussolini figure, or someone like Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So long as this man, it cannot necessarily be a woman, this man shows sufficient authority, and that's what gives people a confidence. Oh, my leader, my ruler is strong enough to lead me. Okay? And this is a very, very bad idea. It has no place in a democracy. What's particularly interesting is that the funerals of martyrs, in other words, the funerals of soldiers who were killed, or policemen who were killed in these attacks on civilians, they became high-profile events. I wrote a book on martyrdom in Turkey because martyrdom is something that many fascist regimes use to build support. So martyrdom suddenly became important once again in Turkey, and the funerals became show funerals. The president, the president's wife, ministers, and religious authorities all claimed that martyrdom was the best thing that a young man can do. Okay? So sounds like 1944, sounds like 1939, Europe. So the president called early elections, and believe it or not, the blood spilled during the summer turned into votes. So the elections were held on 7th of November, early elections, and the governing party, AKP, regained the majority it had lost. So by the end of 2015, the governing party in Turkey recaptured the majority of seats. That's number one. And it was also clear that a strategy of death was in place. Therefore, this is the reason why people such as myself wanted to sign a peace declaration. Now, this is a question. You can say a professor should not sign a peace declaration. But the response from people such as myself would be that we are professors, we are academics, not necessarily professors. Some of them, of the signers of this petition, were doctoral students. We are scholars, and our duty is to serve public interest. In other words, I am a scholar because I want to serve the public. I don't want to serve a king. I don't want to serve the rich people. I would like to serve the public interest. In other words, what's good for the people is what I care about. Therefore, I thought I should sign this, and I did not even think a moment before I signed this peace declaration. This was the right thing to do. Call the government to stop its war on civilians. Okay. Now, the government of Turkey, the current government of Turkey, actually wanted to change the universities for a long time. So what they started to do early this year had its roots in the past. Therefore, if we can take a look at the history of this, I think it would be an easier thing to understand. So what I would like to point out is the current political climate in Turkey it was installed beginning in 1980. The 1980, those years were bad years, dark years in Turkey, because in September 1980, there was a coup d'etat. The military took over, and the military basically killed all institutions, and I mean all institutions of democracy in Turkey. Therefore, when you see what people are doing now in Turkey, and if you're surprised, I would suggest that you should not be surprised. This is a country where all institutions of democracy were attacked and were oppressed for a very long time. But there's also another coup, which was an economic coup. On 24th of January 1980, economic reforms were introduced. These economic reforms were the reforms that led to neoliberal capitalism in Turkey. Okay, so this is something that people often fail to understand. Military regimes are there to serve the rich and the powerful. Therefore, the economic reforms were first introduced, and then the military came to kill all possible sources of opposition to the economic reforms. Okay, so these were the reforms that Reagan wanted to install. These were the reforms that Margaret Thatcher wanted to install. So this was clear neoliberal capitalism coming to Turkey. And the first institution the military government instituted was an agency to control universities. In 1981, just 1 year after the military takeover, the Higher Education Council was founded. In Turkish, we call it YÖK. YÖK was clearly a political mechanism designed to subdue universities and all political movements within them. Okay. Now, if some of you have read the history of the 60s, if you look into what happened in the 70s, you will see again and again that universities played an important role, student movements played an important role in general when we look at protest movements, okay, or movements that actually changed governments. Therefore, it was clear that the military wanted universities to be silenced. So in Turkey, because the universities were the bastion of socialism, the bastion of opposition, universities had to be disciplined. And YÖK also paved the way to private higher education. Another way to control universities is to install private education. Private education, believe it or not, is a very good method to control universities. So when AKP, the governing party in Turkey, came to power, they declared that they were against the Higher Education Council. And they kept repeating this. This is an undemocratic institution. This is a non-democratic institution. We're against it. They said this until they seized control of it. Once they were able to control the Higher Education Council, they stopped opposing it. Now this council is one of the tools that the current government uses to oppress universities. Now, you may want to ask, wasn't there any opposition to this? Well, the truth, however, was that the only opposition to the plans of the government to redesign the universities came from a labor union called Eğitim Sen. Eğitim Sen represents a tradition in Turkey, particularly the tradition of progressive teachers and progressive professors. Professors are not allowed to form a union in Turkey, and this had been a very difficult struggle all along, but professors are now organized under this labor union. It's a small minority, but still part of it. So Eğitim Sen was very clearly part of this opposition to the redesigning of universities. And in June 2012, this labor union called for a meeting. The meeting was going to take place in Akçakoca, which is on the Black Sea coast of Turkey, and I was one of the people who were invited. The day before our meeting started, the headquarters of the labor union was raided by the police. Katerina, can we close the door? I'm feeling cold. Yeah. Thank you. Grazie. Okay. So I want you to get a feeling for this. So what happened in 2015, what happened in 2016 actually has its roots. And the government wanted to control universities and change universities and create a new kind of universities anyway. So the day before our meeting started, the government raided the offices of the labor union, and some of the members of the executive committee were detained. But if you look closely, who were detained? They were detaining only the Kurdish members of the executive committee. They did not detain the others. So what they were playing with was very clearly, these ethnic divisions. So the government always claims that the Kurdish movement is a divisive movement. So one of our friends in this executive committee said, look at them. It is them who are divisive. Even when they detain people, they detain those who are in the Kurdish movement or who are Kurdish and not the others. So we, the professors, wanted to know, do we have this meeting or not? Do we hold this meeting or not? And the person who was representing the executive committee in our meeting said, look, this is what they want to do. This is what they are after. They want to stop us. Therefore, we should have this meeting and not let them stop this meeting. So we held a 2-day meeting and created a document basically which responded to the things that the government wanted to do. It was very clear in 2012 that the government was going to come after the universities and make the universities a conservative type of university. They did not want progressive universities anymore. And in the discussion, if you like, we can go into that. So now this is what we have in Turkey. This is a photograph that made headlines the day it was taken. The man on the right is the person who is the head of the Higher Education Council, and the man who is seated you already know. As you can see, this is a sign of universities bowing to the president. So this is clearly what the government wanted. Just like in the old days, if there is a king, the university has to be subjected to the king. If there is a Mussolini, the universities have to agree with Mussolini. Otherwise, they would be killed. So this is basically what the government wanted. So in July, on the 15th of July, there was a strange, a very funny coup attempt in Turkey. There were tanks on the streets once again, and following the coup, which failed very quickly, a state of emergency was declared. The state of emergency was exactly what the government wanted. The government wanted to rule without any legal constraints. And once the government declared state of emergency, there was no control anymore. Every single law was not applicable. So far as you have emergency, or state of emergency rather, this is what you can do. Now, right after this, all the deans in Turkey were asked to resign. Now, imagine this, all the deans. This had never happened in the world before. And believe it or not a single dean resisted. All the deans resigned. It was clear that not resigning would be punished. Therefore, all of them resigned. And rectors were summoned or called to Ankara by the Higher Education Council, and they were told that everything that was happening was for the sake of democracy. So since July 15th in Turkey, completely unacceptable things have been happening, and everything that happens in Turkey is now for the sake of democracy. So if somebody gets killed, it's for the sake of democracy. If the universities are oppressed, it's for the sake of democracy. Okay, so you can see that this is basically the discourse. That's an unbelievable discourse. So the message, even at the very beginning, after the after the failed coup, was that the regime had full control of the universities and a purge was on the way. The move was presented to the public as a purge. They said, we will clean the universities. And the president said on various occasions that the regime would be ruthless, and that was exactly the case. The removal of the deans was actually a sign of force. It was a sign of force to instill fear in people. Okay. Now, this wasn't enough. In September, thousands and thousands of teachers were fired. Many of them were members of the labor union that I mentioned earlier, Eğitimsen, and there were many academics, more than 2,000 academics who were dismissed from public universities. Okay. And many of these academics who were dismissed were actually opponents of the regime. In November, more people were dismissed. Some of them were teaching assistants, some of them were professors, but these people were considered opponents of the regime. And under the state of emergency, only a decree, a government decree, was sufficient to remove them. Previously, before the state of emergency was declared, you could not fire a professor from a public university. Every professor in a public university had permanent protected position. But after the state of emergency was declared, everything was gone. And the latest blow to academic autonomy in Turkey was recently delivered when the president of Turkey was given powers to appoint rectors of the universities. So now the president of Turkey has the authority to appoint rectors. And so you can guess what type of rectors he would appoint. Okay. Now there are multiple layers of injustice here. And I don't want to sound in any way as if I'm only focused on myself. There are many different types of injustices that I have faced, and this meeting, because it's being videotaped right now, can be used against me. But I am here to tell you the truth. I am not here to tell you lies. Therefore, I'm not afraid. But I don't want to sound as if I'm ignoring other people's suffering. So I will give you a few examples. This is Candan Badem. He is a history professor from Tunceli University. This is a province in Turkey that has always been a very strongly oppositional type of province. This province has the highest literacy rate, etc., etc. But Candan Badem was targeted because he was Marxist. And he always was very clear about his views. And in this Twitter message that he sent a few days ago, he says, I have been kicked out of the university because I had books of a cleric in my office.
I had books
of a religious cleric in my office. This religious cleric is known to be associated with the people who attempted a coup in Turkey. Okay. He lives in Pennsylvania, United States. And people such as myself would read the books that this cleric has written so that we can find out what sorts of lies he's producing. So this professor produced criticisms of this cleric by reading his books. So when the police raided his office, a professor's office was raided, this book, I think only a single book was found in the office, and this book was used against him as evidence. Okay. So he supports the cleric and therefore the coup, etc. So he should be kicked out of the university. When the police raided his home, his computer was taken, his phones were taken, his USB flash disks were taken, okay, and they haven't been returned to him. His bank account was frozen. His bank account at this point is frozen. He cannot withdraw the money, he cannot put money in, so he is persecuted by the government simply because he is a Marxist historian, nothing else. So on a daily basis, you can see him sending Twitter messages. He is unable to travel outside of Turkey because there is a travel ban on him as well. Okay. Now let's look at these 4 people. These 4 people were detained and later arrested earlier this year because they held a press conference. Just like the first press conference, they held a press conference and said, the government started a witch hunt. We insist that our demands for peace were true and the government should listen to us. After the press conference, the government started following them. One of them was outside of Turkey. She returned, and all of them were arrested. They were kept in prison for a while. They were allowed to go free on the 22nd of April, but their court case is continuing. So if you look, their next hearing, the next hearing at court is actually tomorrow. Okay. And the man on the left, Kıvanç Ersoy, is in Salerno right now. He is now a visiting scholar for 6 months, I believe. He is a mathematician, and he is in Salerno, but he was unable to join us today because he's teaching. Okay. It's unbelievable, but it's continuing. Their case is continuing. Okay. They had a hearing on the 27th of September. Nothing came out, etc. But every time there's a hearing, people such as myself, we go on the internet, we put things together, that we always make noise. But the noises of people such as ourselves, the voices of democracy, are very difficult to hear right now in Turkey because the government controls almost all of the media right now. Okay, now that basically is the end of what's happening. Let's very quickly take a look at psychology. I often call psychology a sleeping beauty, but I don't mean all sorts of psychology. I talk about particularly mainstream psychology. Mainstream psychology happens to be very silent when the United States invades Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, for some reason, is not something that many psychologists are concerned about. When there is fiscal austerity, meaning that governments say we cannot provide social services anymore. If you have a kid, you may not be able to send this kid to a preschool, etc. Many psychologists are silent. So I often say psychology is like Sleeping Beauty. It looks beautiful, but it sleeps when bad things happen. Okay. Therefore, I would like to think about how mainstream psychology has not responded to the demise of universities. I'll give you an example from Cairo. Recently, I talked about what's happening to universities in Turkey, and the title of the talk was A Dark Year for Academic Life in Turkey. Not a single psychology professor came to my talk. Not a single student came to my talk. Okay. So, but academic freedom in Egypt is under threat as well. Anything in Egypt is under major threat in Egypt. However, psychologists don't seem to be all that concerned. They have other things to do. And many people you might have heard, they say we're busy. We're busy writing papers, we're busy publishing papers, we're busy revising papers. If the universities are gone, if the universities are under attack, who will produce the next generation of psychologists? This is the question that I ask my colleagues. If the universities disappear, where is science going to take place? Who is going to produce science? Let's move on. Things are complex. So I'll give you a couple of examples just so that we get into something that I think students should hear. Now, what I have found over the years is that authoritarian regimes corrupt universities. In other words, every authoritarian regime produces people who are corrupt. It's not because they are corrupt by nature. It's because that's what the regime produces. Okay. So I have seen unacceptable things happening at the universities. Very unacceptable things. It's unbelievable. But if you look, if you have a regime for 30 years, which is very corrupting, this is what you get. So I'll give you an example. When I was fired from the university, 2 days later, someone, a well-established professor in Turkey, was appointed in my place. She became the new chair of the department. She often claims to have the highest citation ratings in Turkey. So she often gets invited to conferences and she speaks in public like this. She says, I have the highest citation count in Turkey. Okay. So this is who she is. Someone like me gets fired. She has no problem coming in the next day. Solidarity does not count as citation. So she is interested in citations. There is another woman in Turkey who is very well known all over the world as one of the most distinguished psychologists in Turkey. She has never mentioned Kurds in her writings. If you read her books, never ever she mentions Armenians. Never ever she mentions the Greeks. Her books appear to be books that are published in another country where Kurds, where Armenians never existed. Okay. So she often also claims that she is the best psychologist in Turkey. Okay. So if you look at the new system in the universities right now produces a lot of academics who are very interested in publishing, who are very interested in counting citations, who are very interested in producing a big reputation. This is what you get. These are the kinds of people who you get. They might be super distinguished, but they have no sense of justice. Okay, and I really mean this. And I won't give you other examples because we have limited time. So I will give you another kind of corrupting regime, and that's the regime that is currently in power in Europe right now. It is called fiscal austerity. It is in power in the United Kingdom. It is in power in places like Greece, and people are suffering under this. Someone like Angela Merkel can simply say that the people of Greece should take more suffering because Greece has a lot of debt. So every time the new government of Greece, which is a leftist government, makes a decision, it makes a decision in line with fiscal austerity. I consider Greece as my second home. I have many, many friends in Greece. It's unbelievable what they're doing to Greece. But it's all considered proper regime, austerity. And austerity, fiscal austerity, is something that most psychologists are not interested in. If you look, there are very, very few publications. There's, as far as I know, only one publication on fiscal austerity in Italy. Okay, so it looks like fiscal austerity leads to suffering among the masses. Millions of people suffer. Psychologists don't write about this because it's not that important. So I think this is wrong. Therefore, I argue that complexities such as this, if we look closely, are rather ugly complexities. Okay, and if you have any questions regarding these, we can talk about them later. Okay, so in my own research, what I have come to do is this. I follow Hemingway. I often write about things that hurt, and I try to write very clearly. Therefore, if you read the books that I have published in the recent years, they are books about militarism, they are books about personal debt, austerity, etc. And I also published a book on the damage private education has done to the universities in Turkey, because many of the things that you see here are actually supported by private universities. The government in Turkey right now is controlling the private universities very easily because the government decides how many students private universities can take. So private universities make money out of students. So if you control the students, you control the private universities. So I thank you for listening.
I will thank Serdar for his witnessing his professional engagement and his human being engagement, and even the clearly perspective that he gave us on Middle East and Turkey, and in the same time giving a perspective on Europe. And so I think that we need this sort of moment, and I'm happy that you were here for us. And I think it is a big pleasure for us to have the opportunity to share this sort of thing, and and that our university allow us to do this because we are still in time where we can do this. But we are still in time where we can do this, and it is even an opportunity to share experience in our department where we normally have very formal rules, and so we share this with Ugo and with our archaeological colleague. With them, we usually stay in the department, but within our lines of discipline, so not interacting as on a more political perspective. Grazie a tutti, grazie a Serdar.